It was a Monday morning in downtown Seattle, gray light dripping through the glass walls of Synthera Systems. The lobby buzzed with the forced energy of a new era. Fresh banners with the company logo lined the walls, as if fabric could disguise fear. I was halfway to the elevator when the new heir of this empire made his entrance. Julian Cross, tailored navy suit, cufflinks gleaming, stride rehearsed for admiration. He carried himself like a man born to applause, though his resume told another story. His eyes scanned the hallway until they landed on me. He smirked, leaned in just enough for his voice to cut, and said, "We don't need just a pretty face here. Sweetheart, this is a real company, not your hobby." The words hung in the air, vulgar in their casualness. A few heads turned, then turned away faster, the kind of silence that isn't ignorance but complicity. I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that my silence made men like Julian nervous. We reached the conference room, the place where new leadership would be introduced. Charles Cross, his father, and our new CEO offered grand speeches about modernization and vision. Then Julian, standing just behind him, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "As part of our strategic realignment," he said, "we're bringing in a consultant from New York to oversee systems architecture. Althea Serrano's department will transition under his leadership by the end of the quarter." There it was. Not just insult, but erasure, announced like a footnote in their grand plan. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from the quiet certainty that they had underestimated the wrong woman. Julian's smirk returned as his eyes brushed over me, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. I took a seat at the edge of the room, hands folded calmly in my lap, while the consultant's name, someone who had never written a line of code for Helios, flashed across the slides. He thought I'd swallow my pride. He had no idea the ground he was standing on already belonged to me. When Julian announced that consultant's name, I sat still. But inside, memories started unspooling. 6 years earlier, when I first walked into Synthera, there was no gleaming lobby, no billion-dollar valuation. There was only a half-funded idea, a cluttered office above a warehouse, and me too young for their liking, too stubborn to leave. I had turned down a seed investment for my own startup to take this job. Back then, I told myself it was temporary. Just a year or two to pay the bills, sharpen my skills. Instead, Synthera devoured the years, while my own company lived only in notebooks gathering dust in my closet. But Synthera also gave me something else, a crucible, where I forged the systems no one else believed possible. Every framework, every patent application, every sleepless night I spent mapping code on napkins, it all became the backbone of this company. The irony is, the architecture they call Synthera's crown jewel still bears my fingerprints on every line. At my desk, I keep a small frame turned slightly away from the world. Elena, my younger sister, grins back in frozen time. She was only 25 when a hospital's outdated system let her personal data leak. Insurance stalled, treatment delayed, and the cancer moved faster than bureaucracy. I still remember sitting outside her hospital room, laptop balanced on my knees, whispering to her that one day no system would ever fail someone like that again. She laughed, too tired to believe me, but her hand squeezed mine. That promise became my engine. So when Julian smirked and tried to reduce me to a face in a chair, I didn't just hear an insult. I heard a threat to Elena's memory, to the nights I swore her story would mean something. The boardroom applause faded, replaced by chatter about projections and timelines. I stayed quiet, but beneath that quiet lived steel. My work was more than code, more than a paycheck. It was blood, memory, and promise, and I would not let it be stolen. The day after the leadership meeting, the office felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just watchful. Conversation stopped when I entered a room, then picked back up in whispers as soon as I left. I knew that rhythm. It was the sound of a shift in power. By mid-afternoon, I passed the break room and caught two junior developers murmuring, "He wants the entire architecture." One said, "Full diagrams, source notes, everything." They froze when they saw me. I didn't press. I didn't need to. I already knew whose fingerprints were on that order. Back at my desk, I opened my inbox. Buried under project updates was a message flagged board distribution, not meant for me, but accidentally copied. The subject line made my stomach tighten. Status of intellectual property integration. I clicked. Inside was a memo signed by Julian himself, with Charles' initials in the margin. The words leapt out. The adaptive AI system has been fully internalized into Synthera's proprietary technology suite. Fully internalized. My hands clenched on the keyboard. That phrase wasn't casual. In contract law, it meant they were telling the board the patents were already theirs, as if my name on every filing, every timestamp, every development log didn't exist. This wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. They weren't stealing in the shadows. They were paving the road to erase me in daylight, backed by signatures and corporate stamps. For a moment, anger burned so hot I wanted to storm into Charles' office and throw the memo on his desk. But then I breathed. Slow and steady. Paper can cut both ways. Their memo wasn't just a claim, it was evidence. Evidence of intent, of a scheme to misappropriate work that was still mine. I closed the email, downloaded a copy to my personal drive, and leaned back in my chair. Around me, the hum of keyboards continued as if nothing had shifted. But for me, everything had. If they wanted to rewrite history with ink, then I would make sure the ink turned to blood in their ledgers. That night, I didn't stay late at the office. I walked out into the rain with my bag tight against my shoulder, each step echoing with the weight of the memo I had saved. Seattle's streets glistened under streetlights, but my mind was already 3 years back. To the afternoon, I first sat across from my patent attorney. "File them in your name," Rachel had said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "License them to Synthera, but never sign transfer until you're compensated in full. That clause is your armor." I had followed her advice religiously. 6 patents adaptive AI engine, predictive compression, layered authentication, and 3 more refinements all filed under Althea Serrano. Synthera had been granted temporary licenses, renewed annually, each contract stamped with my signature and theirs. None of them had been converted to ownership. Not one. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door, pulled the small fireproof safe from the closet, and set it on the kitchen table. Inside, organized in neat folders, lay every contract, every filing receipt, every renewal letter. I spread them out like cards in a game, only I knew the rules to. Highlighted clauses glowed under the lamplight. Ownership shall remain with the inventor until transfer is executed in writing. Simple. Ironclad. I turned to the photo on the bookshelf. Elena smiled back. Hair windblown from the beach trip we never thought would be our last. I traced the frame with my finger. I promised no one would ever erase me again. I whispered, "Not my name, not yours." The anger that had simmered all day cooled into something sharper. Resolve. Julian thought he was drawing lines across my life with memos and smirks, but the truth was still sitting here, in my drawer, stamped and sealed. The real foundation of Synthera's future wasn't theirs. It was mine, and as I slid the folders back into the safe, I knew exactly how fragile their empire had just become. 2 days later, The launch prep meeting filled the 24th floor conference room with the smell of catered coffee and polished ambition. The room hummed with the anticipation of executives, engineers, and consultants eager to witness the grand unveiling of Project Helios. I took a seat near the back, notebook closed, hands folded, watching. Julian stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, posture wide like a man who believed the room already belonged to him. He clicked the remote, and the screen lit up with slides I knew too well, charts and benchmarks I had generated months earlier during the initial stress tests. "This," he declared, pointing at the graph showing throughput tripling under simulated loads, "is the future of Synthera. Helios is stronger, faster, more adaptive than anything on the market." I almost laughed. Those numbers were mine. The benchmark was mine. The adaptive engine pulsing underneath his claims mine. Yet not a syllable of acknowledgement passed his lips. Charles Cross sat at the table's center, silver hair shining beneath the overhead lights, nodding proudly at his son as if Julian had single-handedly built the backbone of our empire. When Julian emphasized strategic leadership, Charles even placed a hand on his shoulder, sealing the illusion in front of the board. The consultants scribbled notes. Engineers glanced at each other but said nothing. No one challenged him. The air was thick with complicity, the kind of silence bred not by ignorance but by fear of power. I kept my expression even, not a flicker of anger, not a twitch of correction. Fury surged inside me, but I channeled it into stillness. Let them believe I was cornered. Let Julian preen beneath borrowed feathers, because silence can cut sharper than any outburst. And as he clicked to the final slide, basking in applause that wasn't his, I knew my silence was not surrender. It was the blade I was sharpening. The meeting adjourned with handshakes and congratulations, and I rose quietly, slipping out as Julian basked in his counterfeit spotlight. The next morning, I arrived early, before most of the office stirred awake. The hum of servers filled the silence as I slid my laptop into my bag and began collecting the pieces of my life that had accumulated on this desk, my coffee mug from the first AI conference I ever spoke at, the small fern that somehow clung to life under fluorescent lights, and the framed photo of Elena. Each item went into the box with steady hands. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out the secure hard drives, black casings labeled in my handwriting. They held the raw drafts, the iterations, the versions of the frameworks I had built before Synthera had even licensed them. I placed them on top of the stack, heavier than they looked. Those drives were the real heart of the company, and they had always belonged to me. By the time the first wave of employees arrived, my desk was bare. A few glanced curiously, whispered, but said nothing. Whispers were cheap currency in this place. Silence was more valuable. As I walked toward the elevators, box in my arms, Julian appeared from the glass-walled conference room. He spotted me and grinned like a cat catching a mouse mid-escape. "Don't run off, sweetheart," he called, loud enough for everyone in earshot. "We'll still need your smile around here." I didn't answer. I didn't even break stride. His voice bounced down the hallway, hollow against the steel and glass. I pressed the elevator button, eyes fixed forward, and when the doors slid open, I stepped inside without looking back. He thought I was surrendering, shrinking away from the spotlight he'd stolen. What he couldn't see was the folder of contracts already safe at home, the patents in my name, the proof that his empire was built on sand. The doors closed between us with a quiet thud, and I felt the weight of the box settle into my arms, not as a burden, but as leverage. The real fight hadn't ended here. It was only beginning. The rain came in sheets that night, tapping against my apartment windows like impatient fingers. I sat at the kitchen table with folders spread out, the hum of the city muffled under the storm. Across from me, Rachel Mears adjusted her glasses and tapped a pen against the draft of our cease and desist. "Timing is everything," she said. "We serve it Monday, 10 a.m., sharp. That's early enough to force panic, late enough they can't pivot before the Tuesday launch." I nodded, tracing the bolded clauses in the document. Every line was a reminder that Julian Smirk had no standing in court. My name, my patents, my terms. Rachel leaned back. "You understand. Althea. Once this goes out, they'll come at you hard. Sabotage. Theft. Whatever sticks. You'll need to hold steady. I've been holding steady for 6 years." I said. "They're the ones shaking." My phone buzzed before Rachel could answer. An unfamiliar number, government exchange code. I hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Serrano," a voice said, low and careful. "I represent a federal client. We've been monitoring Project Helios. If you sever ties with Synthera, we're prepared to discuss a direct contract for your authentication framework." I sat very still. "You're saying I'm saying the market needs your tech, not their spin. If you stand alone, you won't be standing alone for long." The line went quiet after that, leaving only the rain and the pulse in my throat. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Friends in high places, maybe," I murmured, "or maybe the beginning of something bigger." I closed the folder, set the pen down, and looked out at the dark skyline. Synthera thought they were cutting me loose, but what they didn't see was that freedom and exile can look the same until the exile builds an empire. Rachel slid the envelope across the table. "Then we're ready." I rested my hand on the paper. Steady, already picturing the ballroom stage at the Hyatt where Helios would meet its reckoning. Tuesday morning. The Hyatt Regency Ballroom gleamed like a stage dressed for triumph. Rows of investors in tailored suits, reporters clutching tablets, cameras perched on tripods, every eye fixed on the massive LED wall emblazoned with the Helios logo. I sat near the back, unnoticed, a spectator to the spectacle they believed was their coronation. Charles Cross strode onto the stage, silver hair immaculate, voice polished with decades of boardroom authority. He spoke of disruption, market leadership, the dawn of a new era. Then, with a theatrical sweep of his arm, he welcomed his son. Julian emerged grinning, sleeves rolled like a savior, ready to get his hands dirty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today we show you the future." He gestured to the QR code projected on the wall. "Scan, log in, and see Helios live." The crowd obeyed. Phones raised in unison, the screen filling with dashboards and charts. For 3 seconds, it looked flawless. Then came the stutter. A spinning wheel, a red error banner, another, and another. Murmurs rippled through the room. Investors frowned. Reporters angled closer. The LED wall refreshed, only to collapse into a storm of authentication failed messages. On the side screen, dashboards froze mid-load. The applause that Julian expected never came. From the wings, I caught sight of Charles with his phone pressed tight to his ear, jaw clenched. His voice, sharp enough to slice the air, carried farther than he intended. "Who shut us down?" Julian tried to recover, laughing thinly. "Just launched jitters," he said, waving at the frozen screens. "Our team is on it." But the veneer cracked. Sweat beaded at his temple. Behind him, staff scrambled, cords yanked, laptops opened, consultants shouting over one another. The audience shifted in their seats, restless. Cameras clicked like hammers driving nails into a coffin. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, watching the empire crumble under its own lights. By the end of the week, Headlines bled across every tech outlet: Helios launch implodes. Authentication catastrophe wipes out millions. Investors flee Synthera. The fallout was immediate and merciless. 3 of our largest contracts were canceled overnight. The stock plummeted 40% in 4 trading days. What they had called the future had turned into an anchor dragging them under. I watched from my apartment, news alerts piling on my phone, each one a confirmation that their empire had been built on borrowed bones. On Thursday evening, my phone rang. Charles Cross. His voice, stripped of polish, rasped like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Althea," he began. "We're prepared to discuss terms. Synthera needs stability, and you have the leverage to provide it. Name your price, we'll purchase the patents outright." For a moment, silence stretched between us. I remembered the way he'd ignored me in the boardroom, how he'd beamed at Julian while my work was paraded as someone else's glory. That memory steadied me more than any legal clause ever could. "No," I said finally. "They're not for sale." He bristled. "Without them." "The company. Without them. Your company never had a foundation to begin with. What I'm willing to offer is a temporary license. 3 years. Non-exclusive. Strict payment terms. You'll limp forward, but you won't own me. And you won't own my work." His exhale crackled across the line, half defeat, half disbelief. "You're condemning us." "No," I said softly. "I'm giving you the only lifeline you've got left." When I hung up, I let the quiet fill the room. The same men who had dismissed me now circled like supplicants, and the power they thought was their inheritance now sat entirely in my hands. By Friday, the papers were signed. A license, not a surrender. And as I filed the copies into my safe, I felt the shift as clearly as if the ground itself had tilted. The licensing deal gave me breathing room, but I knew from the start it wasn't an ending. Synthera could limp forward, but their arrogance had already hollowed them out. I didn't want to be tethered to their decline. I wanted to build something new. 2 weeks later, I met again with the government client who had called me that rainy night. They didn't come with speeches or empty promises. They came with seed investment and a simple message: "We trust you more than them." That was enough. Astrevia Labs was incorporated within a month, operating out of a converted warehouse on the east side of Seattle. I recruited deliberately. The quiet engineers Synthera had overlooked. The developers who'd worked 12-hour days for half their worth. The ones whose talent had been wasted under Julian's bravado. They came one by one, not for a paycheck, but for the promise that this time their names would not be erased. We grew quickly. Contracts arrived, first small, then bigger, until Astrevia became the name whispered in boardrooms as the alternative Synthera could never be. I didn't watch their decline with malice, only inevitability. Their leadership kept patching, spinning, denying, until finally the company was bought for a fraction of what it once claimed to be worth. Julian disappeared from the industry. Charles retired into silence. 3 years later, I stood in Astrevia's glass-walled office, the rain streaking down just as it had the night I packed my box. Behind me, my team raised glasses to a newly signed contract with NASA. Their laughter filled the space, unforced, alive. I turned back to the window, watching the city lights shimmer across the bay. They had called me a pretty face, a placeholder. But faces fade. Work endures. And mine was no longer hidden in a drawer or buried under someone else's name. It was carved into the future.